So today I want to talk about Texas and their power grid system. The state of Texas is currently going through a disaster. Due to a number of factors, many of which could have been avoided, a lot of people, especially those in some of the most vulnerable places in Texas, are suffering. Human life has been lost and continues to be at risk, as power is not available to people, while frigid temperatures and snow prove to be a problem for Texas's power companies. Now, in this video, I want to cover a few different aspects of all of this. Namely, I want to go into the background of the issues with Texas and power. I want to talk about how this is not an issue around renewable energy sources, as some Texas politicians in particular have asserted. And I want to talk about how the real issue involved is probably more tied to the deregulation of markets and the for-profit models that are incentivized under the current systems in Texas, and how this has essentially created a scenario where the needs of people are not prioritized first. Before all of that, though, I want to take some time to recognize the loss of life and people that are suffering. This has been and should be recognized as a federal emergency. The Biden administration and the state of Texas have come to whatever terms they needed to in order for FEMA to be granted permission to mobilize in Texas as necessary. Now, there are a number of reports of people getting sick or dying from a combination of carbon monoxide and starting fires. There has been situations on the ground where people have literally been found frozen to death in the street. And this loss of life and this atrocity that we're talking about should be recognized. And my heart goes out to anyone who is dealing with the on-the-ground issues in Texas right now. And anyone who's lost anybody, who's worried about someone who's at risk or has family members there, my heart goes out to you all. Because this is something that should have been preventable. This is something that I want to discuss because it's something that should not have happened in the first place. And we need to make sure that this type of thing doesn't happen again and that we focus on humanitarian outcomes. And just briefly going over, whenever we have a crisis like this, it is always communities that are disregarded that get hurt first and foremost. You have cases where you have people driving around the city trying to gather people in to huddle them into gyms and churches and anywhere that still was able to manage to keep the electricity on to make sure people were warm during this whole crisis. You had people beforehand trying to make arrangements with hotels and shelters because we knew the storm was coming in Texas. And like Yasmin Smith here reports, she does what she can because she can't bear the thought of someone dying under a bridge. We've had cases of people moving into their cars to try to get heat and dying of carbon monoxide poisoning. And we've also had a situation in Harris County where there's been more than 300 carbon monoxide poisoning cases as the temperatures bottomed out. And it's filling up emergency rooms. In general, this is what we're dealing with because people have had no alternatives to heat. And there are potentially alternative ways and methods to deal with it, but being able to light a stove or a propane tank or anything gas-based in your home is not really a good look right now. Carbon monoxide is a real threat, and the unfortunate reality is people are making an active choice between heat and really bad heating options. And again, this has caused fires, carbon monoxide poisoning, and so much more. So with all of that said, and with a heavy heart, really, let's talk about the story behind Texas's power grid. Now, first of all, Texas has its own power grid. Its power grid is separate from the rest of the United States. And the reason for this is that in 1935, President FDR signed the Federal Power Act, which charged that a Federal Power Commission would oversee any electricity that was moved between states. So any states that had an interstate arrangement would go under the federal government. And that is how the federal government has generally run itself in its history. It regulates interstate commerce issues. That has always been a power of the federal government. So the FDR administration said that as long as electricity was crossing state lines, it would be responsible for it. However, Texas managed to avoid federal regulation by not having any electricity cross its borders, in or out. And so Texas utilities have been in a desire to avoid federal regulations and rules on their own power grid. The rest of the country functions on either an eastern or western interconnection that allows energy to be bought and sold or spread between different states and regions as necessary. So this Texas situation really just starts off with Texas being independent from the rest of the country in this particular way. And then, as we know, they have moved into further deregulation. And ERCOT, the institution that is responsible for this in Texas, that actually does have a few different tie-ins, and they've been major issues every single time. There's actually 3 tie-ins they have to the grid in Mexico, and they utilized that in 2011 when a similar situation happened where cold temperatures knocked out some state power. And again, proof that we knew this 10 years ago, that this was a possibility for Texas to have to deal with. They borrowed from Mexico. So even with all the politicians coming out and speaking out against the border and trying to prevent people from crossing the border from Mexico and all the issues there, it was very comfortable for the state of Texas to borrow electricity from the Mexican government. So they also have 2 ties in with the eastern U.S. grid, and because of loopholes, they were able to put some sort of situation together that allowed them to remain autonomous. Because Texas's autonomy in all of this has been of the utmost importance to them. And so really what this all boils down to is a major issue where Texas has very limited connections to buy or sell in to their electricity grid, essentially leaving everybody on their own. And ERCOT has been part of this whole process. So next I want to move into the topic of, well, was it a renewable energy issue? You know, there have been politicians that have been trying to make the claim that this had to do with wind turbines shutting down and that renewable energy is to blame for all of this. And funny enough, even Ted Cruz kind of had the sense to kind of be quiet about this. However, Dan Crenshaw did not. He posted the following on Twitter. 1. It's a once-in-a-century weather event. California has constant energy problems and high prices. 2. The reason for blackouts is complex, but in summary, Texas took too many lessons from Cali, over-subsidized renewable energies, and pushed out baseload energy like natural gas. This all couldn't be further from the truth. First of all, blaming California and trying to shift the blame during this is ridiculous. This was not a once-in-a-century weather event. Again, I pointed out that this happened in 2011, and it seems to happen about once in a decade. This just happens to be the worst of all of them. But in general, these kinds of Arctic waves tend to hit Texas about once every 10 years, and as climate change continues to happen, we have to take into account that this might be happening more and more often. We can't depend on a lot of the old weather patterns. And Dan Crenshaw is probably a climate denier from what I know. A lot of politicians in that region will deny that climate change is a thing, but I think it's something that we need to look at moving forward and create regulations and standards around the idea that these type of things can and will happen more often. There's always that possibility. But the issue involved is not one strictly of renewable energy sources. As the Texas Tribune points out, this was not just frozen wind turbines that went down. An official from the Electric Reliability Council of Texas said Tuesday afternoon that 16 gigawatts of renewable energy generation, mostly wind generation, was offline. However, nearly double that, 30 gigawatts, had been lost from thermal sources, which include gas, coal, and nuclear energy. What actually has transpired here is that nearly half of the state's natural gas production screeched to a halt because of the low temperatures, while freezing components at natural gas-fired power plants forced some operators to shut down. So what's really going on here is a combination of factors when it comes to the cold. Essentially, the wind turbines, did freeze. They were not able to function. There's workarounds for that, but they were not able to function. In addition, gas pipes actually froze from water condensation, so gas could not be pushed into facilities. Nuclear facilities ended up suffering because the water that was required to keep the plants cool, ironically enough, could not make it in because pipes froze over. In general, this was a power issue due to the fact that the infrastructure in Texas was not equipped to handle the cold. And again, we can't say that this was a once-in-a-lifetime situation, that this was something that we couldn't have prepared for because Texas has never dealt with frigid temperatures before. 10 years ago, it dealt with a similar situation. And we've been seeing temperatures in Texas dip over the years. This is something that Texas really should have been prepared for. And it wasn't for a number of different reasons. When you look at the root causes behind all of this behavior, you get something like this. I think that this is basically planning for insurance. Jenkins, this person from ERCOT, I believe, said, "How much insurance do you want to pay for? You have to pay more for more insurance. You hope you never have to use it. The best insurance is the insurance you never have to claim. In hindsight, when you do have a tragedy strike, you start to second guess whether you should have been paying more all along." He said preventative measures could have included burying pipelines lower or including more insulation or installing heating systems on wind turbines to keep them from locking due to ice, even requiring more insulation in homes to better handle cold temperatures. He noted could have helped on the demand side. All of those cost more money, though, and the question is, how much do you want to spend up front for events that happen very rarely, but when they do, can be very dangerous given the cold conditions that can happen? And so this really is an important question. How much do you value human life in a crisis situation? In an event that might happen once every 10 years, or as climate change happens, maybe happening more often, how much do you value human life in these types of crisis situations? And from my perspective, from where I sit, human life should be calculated as invaluable. We should not be putting a price on it when the price is really not that expensive in the grand scheme of things, especially as we create more renewable sources, as we start moving towards different forms of energy being produced. It's something that we should be considering while building new infrastructure and repairing old ones. I also want to point out, just as an aside, funny aside, from some of the reports that I was reading, it looked like some of the wind turbines on the coast were actually subsidizing a lot of this stuff because as the storm brewed and was pushing high winds, there was actually increase in energy output from some of the wind turbines, despite what Dan Crenshaw and a lot of other politicians are talking about. So again, this is not an issue specifically of, renewable energy sources failing. The energy failed across the board because they were not equipped to handle for frozen temperatures. And with that said, I think this brings us to the main point, which is that deregulated utilities tend to function in this way. Whether it's hospitals and medicine, whether it's water supplies, whether it's electric companies, having a deregulated industry running on for-profit models, simply based on the investors and their whims, and not on the communal needs of people in preparing for a disaster or in thinking about the long-term disaster effects that could happen, generally speaking, creates a bad situation. In order to cut corners and lower prices for consumers and to compete, companies will always cut corners. And those corners are almost always in safety regulations. Or, eliminating fringe cases. In the particular case of electricity, there's often situations where people on the furthest parts of an electric grid, which are the most expensive to pay for, are the first people shut down. And when you end up dealing with a combination of that and a cut in safety regulations, it means that storms like this are going to cause a loss of human life. And we should be creating situations to prepare for that. To further back all of that up, what has sent Texas reeling is not an engineering problem, nor is it the frozen wind turbines blamed by prominent Republicans. It is a financial structure for power generation that offers no incentives to power plant operators to prepare for winter. In the name of deregulation and free markets, critics say Texas has created an electric grid that puts an emphasis on cheap prices over a reliable service. It's a Wild West market designed based on short-term prices, said Matt Breitbart, a portfolio manager at a firm. And yet, the temporary train wreck of that market, Monday and Tuesday, has seen the wholesale price of electricity in Houston go from $22 a megawatt hour to $9,000. $9,000 a megawatt hour. That's that's nearly a 10,000% increase. I don't even know what to say about that. They went from $22 to $9,000 per megawatt hour. That is absurd. Meanwhile, 4 million Texas households have been without power. And that's what happens in a for-profit situation. When you hit crisis, and this happens in any type of crisis, the value of scarce commodities, whether it be water or electricity or heating, goes up. If you're functioning on a pure for-profit system, prices will go up because the demand will become incalculable. The supplies will be limited, and the demand for such things will be invaluable, which only ever prioritizes the wealthy and rich, people who can afford to pay through their teeth for something as valuable as electricity and heating during a frigid climate or weather-related event. And this is what happens. This is why when we look at a hospital and we sit there and say, well, what is the price of saving one's life in a life-saving surgery? It's incalculable. What is the price of heat when someone is about to freeze to death? It is incalculable. This is when we hit the point where human life needs to be measured as incalculable and safety precautions need to be put into place beforehand to stop this. And the fact is, deregulation hasn't even created a better scenario in terms of pricing. That seems to be a myth. In fact, if we look at values from 1997, states that deregulated actually had an increase of 0.3 cents more than in regulated states. Now, the trends seem to look more or less the same, according to this chart produced by Public Power. The information seems to be the same. Now, depending on what year you decide to examine things from, if you look at something like 2008, you might be able to make a case that the price difference is actually a little better in terms of the deregulated states versus regulated states. But the type of the type of value that we are talking about is minuscule at best. We are not talking about a huge shift in price from deregulated to regulated situations. And the reason that the deregulated states are higher than the national average is that states that have had higher costs have attempted the deregulation model. But again, the trends in pricing seem to be consistent whether you're deregulated or regulated, and conform to the national average. And you should be following the shape of this graph, not the actual particular markers. And again, for more or less everything is the same. So there isn't really an incentive to deregulate in terms of cost. So with that said, what does it do? What is the point of it? If it's not driving down costs, for real, and if we can only see maybe minimal benefits to it, and again, based on certain averages, possibly even a loss of benefit from it, should we be prioritizing for-profit systems that seem to be harming people and leading to disaster situations like this? And I don't think we should. I think I'd like to see a movement in this country towards community-run democratic institutions that are guided by experts. Situations where we focus on making sure that the wind turbines have a heating system in place, making sure that pipes are have some sort of thermal covering, or are dug deep enough in order to prevent, the pipes from freezing over. Connecting Texas to the main grid of the country, either the eastern or western one, so that if they ever have a crisis like this again, you don't have a situation where they're stuck by themselves and they have to either borrow from Mexico or, borrow through these one or two limited connections that can just barely get electricity into the thing. Actually properly connect them and keep them under federal regulation. Federal safety regulations need to be considered. And that's something that's not really talked about in these deregulation conversations. Safety regulations are the main reason for it. And it might be better to pay that little bit up front, because the loss of the number of people who have died is incalculable. You can't calculate the life lost. You cannot calculate that loss in terms of a societal situation. And these institutions are designed to protect the society as a whole, on a communal aspect. We need to look at it from that perspective, rather than whether or not a few people are going to be able to save maybe $5 on their electric bill, over the course of a month. That just doesn't seem to add up. Can we say that small cost benefit for each individual who had to deal with that is worth human life? I don't think I'm willing to make that argument. So what I really think and would like to see is that Texas needs to start moving towards joining the federal grids. I think we need to start seeing a movement in the country as a whole towards a prioritizing of human life through some sort of more public understanding of utilities. Maybe the current monopolistic models of private companies running the public utilities hasn't worked for a lot of people. So maybe we need to start moving in a direction where, again, things are democratically run, where we have these for-profit models eliminated into more not-for-profit models, and that prioritize the conditions of life over financial gain. Maybe then we'll start to see these crisis situations averted, and maybe we'll stop having to cover all these stories, because it's really getting exhausting having to cover story after story where things are preventable, where human life could be saved, and it's not being prioritized. And it's really just a situation of bad infrastructure and bad planning, and prioritizing models that just don't work for people. With that said, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button and bell for notifications. You can follow me on Twitter. Check out my Discord in the description down below. My name is Anarchist Tara, and I hope you enjoyed watching.